Let me ask you something, and don't answer out loud. Just think about it for a second. Have you ever been sitting right next to someone, physically close, talking, laughing, sharing time, but deep down you could feel they weren't really seeing you anymore? Like your presence had become normal, expected, almost invisible? Yeah, that moment right there is where everything begins to shift. Here's the part most men are never told. People don't always miss what's good for them while it's there. They miss it after it's gone or after it emotionally steps back. And when a woman takes a man for granted, it's rarely because he did something wrong. More often, it's because he did too much without requiring respect in return. Now, this might sound uncomfortable, maybe even controversial, but stay with me. When you're always available, always understanding, always adjusting, your value slowly stops registering. Not because she's a bad person, but because human psychology adapts fast. What's constant becomes background noise, and here's where things flip. The moment you stop over-explaining, stop chasing, stop proving, and stop filling every silence, something strange happens in her mind. The emotional safety she assumed would always be there suddenly isn't guaranteed. And uncertainty, that wakes people up. This isn't about playing games. It's not about manipulation. It's about understanding a simple psychological truth. Absence creates contrast. When your attention is no longer automatic, it becomes noticeable. When your energy is no longer free, it gains weight. Women don't start missing a man because he begs to be remembered. They start missing him when they realize the version of him they overlooked is no longer fully accessible. And this realization doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in quietly, during moments of silence, during small inconveniences, during times when she expects you to show up, and you don't. In this video, I'm going to break down exactly how and why that shift happens. Not to turn you cold, not to make you distant, but to help you understand how respect, value, and emotional gravity actually work, so you stop being taken for granted and start being felt. And once you understand this, you'll never approach attention the same way again. 1. Why she values you. Less when you give too much. Let me say this like I'm talking to you right now, sitting next to you, because this is the part most men miss. If you're constantly available, constantly understanding, constantly giving, and constantly adjusting yourself to keep things smooth, it feels right, it feels mature, it feels loving, but psychologically, that's where your value quietly starts slipping. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Effort without boundaries doesn't register as value. It registers as certainty. And certainty, when it's unlimited, gets taken for granted. Now, before this gets twisted the wrong way, this isn't about being cold, selfish, or unkind. It's about how the human brain works. People are wired to notice contrast. When something is always there, always reliable, always saying yes, the mind stops measuring it. It becomes assumed. Think about it like this. If something is free and unlimited, you don't check the price. You don't think about losing it, you don't protect it. Not because it's worthless, but because it feels permanent. When you give too much emotionally, you remove uncertainty, you remove tension, you remove the need for her to invest. And when there's no investment, appreciation fades. This is where many men get confused. They think, if I love harder, she'll see my value. But attraction and respect don't work like a reward system. They work like an exchange. Value is felt when effort is matched, not when it's one-sided. Here's the controversial part most people won't say out loud. When you overextend, you teach people how little it costs to keep you. Not because she's intentionally exploiting you, but because you're unintentionally removing your own weight from the dynamic. When you're always the one initiating conversations, always fixing problems, always reassuring, always explaining yourself, you're sending a quiet message. I'll stay no matter what. And once that message is received, the urgency to protect the connection disappears. And here's where female psychology plays a key role. Emotional attraction isn't sustained by comfort alone. It's sustained by presence mixed with independence. When a woman feels like your world revolves around her, she stops wondering where she stands. And when there's nothing to wonder about, the emotional spark weakens. That's why men who have purpose, boundaries, and standards, even when they care deeply, are often valued more. Not because they give less love, but because their love isn't guaranteed on demand. Giving too much doesn't make you noble. It makes you predictable. And predictability without respect becomes invisible. The shift happens when you stop pouring endlessly and start allowing space for reciprocity. When your time, attention, and energy are chosen, not automatically given. When your presence feels intentional, not habitual, that's when she starts noticing changes. That's when she starts feeling the absence of what she assumed would always be there. And that's when value returns, not because you demanded it, but because you stopped giving it away freely. This isn't about withdrawing to punish. It's about stepping back to rebalance. Because the moment you stop overgiving is often the moment she starts realizing what she stopped appreciating. And once that realization hits, everything else begins to change. 2. How comfort slowly kills emotional desire. Let me say this in a way that really lands, because this part sneaks up on a lot of men without them realizing it. Comfort feels like success. It feels like stability. It feels like I've done my job right. And to a point it is. But when comfort becomes the main emotion in a connection, desire doesn't grow. It quietly fades. Now listen carefully. Comfort itself isn't the enemy. Stagnation is. When everything becomes predictable, when your reactions are always the same, when your presence is guaranteed no matter what, the emotional edge disappears. The relationship stops feeling alive and starts feeling managed. Here's the controversial truth most people avoid. Emotional desire thrives on contrast, not constant reassurance. When you always respond immediately, always agree, always smooth things over, and always show up the same way, there's nothing left to feel. There's no tension, no curiosity, no sense of emotional movement. And again, this isn't about drama or conflict, it's about depth. Human psychology needs stimulation, not chaos, but variation. Think about how attraction works early on. There's uncertainty, there's mystery, there's space to wonder, and that wondering creates emotional pull. But when comfort turns into emotional autopilot, that pull weakens. Here's where many men make a critical mistake. They think keeping everything calm, easy, and predictable will preserve desire. But what it actually preserves is routine, and routine without excitement becomes dull. From a psychological perspective, desire is linked to engagement. When someone feels like they have to emotionally show up, contribute, and stay aware, you remain interesting. But when everything is handled for them, there's nothing left to invest in. This is why excessive emotional availability can backfire. When you're always there, always ready, always open, your presence loses impact. It's no longer something felt, it's something assumed. And here's the subtle shift that happens on her side. She doesn't think, I don't like him anymore. She thinks, something feels different, or worse, something feels flat. That's comfort overtaking desire. Female psychology responds strongly to emotional polarity, the balance between closeness and independence. When a man has his own direction, his own rhythm, his own emotional center, his presence feels grounded. But when his energy revolves completely around the relationship, the polarity collapses. Comfort turns into emotional sameness. And sameness doesn't inspire longing. This is why pulling back slightly, not emotionally disconnecting, but recentering yourself, can reignite attention. When you stop filling every silence, when you stop explaining every feeling, when you stop making yourself emotionally predictable, suddenly there's space again. Space for curiosity, space for thought, space for reflection, and that space creates awareness. Comfort doesn't kill desire overnight. It erodes it slowly, quietly, almost politely, until one day she realizes she hasn't felt anything deeply in a while. The solution isn't to remove comfort, it's to balance it with presence, purpose, and unpredictability in healthy ways. When your life is full, your time is valued. When your energy is focused, your attention feels meaningful. And that's when comfort stops being dull and starts feeling secure and attractive again. That's the difference most men never get taught. 3. The moment. She realizes you're no longer chasing. Let me talk to you like this is a quiet moment between us, because this realization doesn't happen loudly. There's no announcement, no argument, no dramatic goodbye. It happens internally, in silence, when she starts noticing something feels different and she can't immediately explain why. The moment she realizes you're no longer chasing isn't about distance. It's about absence of effort she expected. Messages don't come as fast. You're not always initiating. You're not over-explaining your intentions or checking in just to reassure. And suddenly, the dynamic shifts. Here's the part most men underestimate. Chasing creates emotional certainty. When you're always pursuing, she never has to question where she stands. But when that pursuit fades, the certainty fades with it, and the mind doesn't like emotional gaps. This isn't about ignoring her. It's about redirecting your focus back to yourself. And when that happens, she feels the change before she understands it. She starts thinking about conversations that didn't happen, about energy that feels different, about how she used to expect you to show up in a certain way, and now you don't. And here's the key psychological shift. When you stop chasing, she starts noticing. Not because you demanded attention, but because your attention is no longer freely given. This moment often brings confusion before anything else. Not anger, not sadness, confusion. She might ask herself why things feel less predictable, why she's thinking about you more instead of less, why the emotional comfort she relied on isn't automatic anymore. And that's when reflection begins. When you were chasing, she didn't need to reflect. She didn't need to question the dynamic. Everything was clear. Everything was secure. But once that security becomes uncertain, the mind starts replaying interactions, reevaluating behavior, and reassessing value. This is where many men panic and undo the shift. They feel the distance and rush back in. They explain, they reassure, they overcorrect. And the moment they do, the tension disappears and so does the awareness. But when you hold your ground, not coldly, not emotionally withdrawn, but calmly centered, you allow the process to complete. She begins to feel the absence of emotional pressure you used to provide. The constant checking, the constant availability, the constant pursuit. And in that space, something important happens. She starts to feel the weight of your presence by noticing its reduction, not because you vanished, but because you changed how you show up. This realization isn't painful at first, it's subtle. It's a quiet internal question. Why does this feel different? And that question leads to awareness. Awareness leads to appreciation. And appreciation often leads to missing what was once taken for granted. This is why chasing less doesn't push someone away. It reveals the true balance of the connection. It shows whether interest was mutual or simply sustained by your effort. When you stop chasing, you're not trying to be missed. You're simply allowing space for reality to show itself. And that moment, when she realizes you're no longer chasing, is often the moment she starts emotionally catching up to where you already are. 4. Why losing access hurts more than losing. You let me be direct with you here, but calm and honest, because this part requires a little self-awareness. Many men misunderstand what actually creates emotional impact. They think being physically present or emotionally available is enough. It's not. What matters more is access. Who gets consistent access to your time, attention, and emotional energy? Here's the hard truth. If you give unlimited access to someone who hasn't earned it, you train them to treat it as ordinary. And this is where a lot of men lose leverage without realizing it. This isn't an attack, it's a wake-up call. When you make yourself endlessly accessible, you remove any sense of cost. Your replies, your reassurance, your emotional labor, it's all on demand. Over time, that access becomes expected rather than appreciated. And when access is expected, its loss is what creates the emotional reaction. Not the loss of you as a person, but the loss of what you provided. That's why when you pull back, the discomfort shows up, not immediately as longing, but as irritation or confusion. The mind notices the missing access before it processes the missing connection. Now here's where the criticism comes in, because this is where men sabotage themselves. Too many men give full emotional access before there's mutual respect. They overshare, they over-explain, they overcommit, and then they're shocked when their absence finally matters more than their presence ever did. That's not bad luck. That's misalignment. You can't expect someone to value what you never protected. And protecting your access doesn't mean becoming distant or unavailable on purpose. It means being intentional. It means understanding that your time and emotional energy are resources, not obligations. Here's the advice you need to hear. Stop handing out full access to people who haven't shown they value it. When you start valuing your own attention, others are forced to do the same. When you stop being instantly reachable, your presence gains weight. When you stop emotionally over-delivering, your contributions become noticeable. This is when the psychological shift happens. Losing access creates friction. Friction creates awareness, and awareness leads to reflection. Not because you manipulated anything, but because the dynamic finally changed. If you're always there, there's nothing to lose. If you're always available, there's nothing to miss. And this is the part men need to wake up to. Being a good man doesn't mean being endlessly accessible. It means having standards for how your presence is treated. When access is balanced, it feels healthy. When it's unlimited, it feels disposable. So the goal isn't to be missed, it's to be respected. And respect begins the moment you decide that your time, energy, and emotional presence are valuable enough to be shared intentionally. That's the difference between being taken for granted and being truly felt. 5. How silence forces her to re-evaluate your worth. Let's slow this down and talk plainly because silence is one of the most misunderstood forces in human psychology. Most men fear silence. They rush to fill it. They explain, reassure, check in, clarify. And they do it because silence feels like loss of control. But here's what rarely gets explained to you. Silence doesn't erase value. Misused words do. Silence, when it comes from emotional stability rather than resentment, creates space. And space creates reflection. When you stop reacting to everything, stop defending yourself, stop filling emotional gaps that aren't yours to fill, something important happens on her side. The emotional noise disappears. And in that quiet, she starts hearing her own thoughts. This is where reevaluation begins. As long as you're constantly present, talking, fixing, reassuring, there's no reason to think deeply. Everything is handled, everything is predictable. But when your voice isn't always there, your absence becomes noticeable. Not dramatic, not painful, just noticeable. And that notice creates questions. Silence doesn't say, I don't care. It says, I'm grounded enough not to chase clarity. That's powerful. Here's the key distinction most men miss. Silence isn't withdrawal. It's restraint. It's choosing not to overperform emotionally. It's allowing the connection to breathe instead of suffocating it with constant presence. When you go quiet in a healthy way, she's left alone with the dynamic as it actually is, not padded, not softened, not managed by your effort. And that's when reassessment happens. She starts replaying moments. She starts noticing patterns. She starts realizing how much emotional structure you used to provide. Not because you reminded her, but because she felt the difference. This is why silence often feels louder than arguments. Arguments distract, silence focuses. It removes stimulation and forces awareness inward. And here's the part that matters for you as a man. Silence works only when it's paired with self-respect. Not passive aggression, not emotional punishment, just calm presence without over-explanation. When your silence comes from confidence, it communicates value. It signals that you're okay standing on your own emotional footing, that you don't need constant validation to stay centered, and that changes how you're perceived. Suddenly, your words carry more weight because there are fewer of them. Your attention feels intentional because it's no longer automatic. Your presence feels chosen because it is. This is when worth gets reevaluated, not because you demanded it, not because you explained it, but because you allowed space for it to be felt. Silence gives people room to miss what they stop noticing. It allows appreciation to form naturally instead of being forced. And most importantly, it reveals whether the connection was built on mutual value or sustained by your constant effort. So remember this, silence isn't a tactic. It's a result of emotional maturity. When you no longer feel the need to fill every gap, you stop being background noise and start being a presence that's actually felt. Let me leave you with a statement that most people won't like, but deep down they know it's true. The moment you stop being endlessly available is the moment people are forced to decide whether they value you or just the way you made them feel. That idea makes people uncomfortable because it removes the illusion. It strips away excuses. It exposes whether a connection was built on mutual respect or quietly held together by your effort alone. If someone only feels your absence when your effort disappears, then it was never your presence they valued. It was your consistency. And that realization can be painful, but it's also freeing. This isn't about blaming women. It's not about bitterness or control. It's about understanding how emotional dynamics actually work and choosing to stop betraying yourself in the process. Most men aren't taken for granted because they're weak. They're taken for granted because they were never taught how to protect their value while still being genuine. They were taught to give, to adapt, to overextend, and to call that love. But real connection doesn't require self-erasure. It requires balance. If this video hit something personal, good. That means you're paying attention. And if you've lived through moments where pulling back changed everything, or where staying too long cost you respect, I want you to talk about it. Drop a comment about your experience. Say what you noticed. Say what shifted. I read them. And when something stands out, I reach out. Not as an expert talking down to you, but as someone who understands how confusing these dynamics can be when no one explains them clearly. This channel isn't about turning cold, it's about waking up. About becoming grounded enough that your presence is chosen, not assumed. If you take anything from this, take this with you. You don't need to disappear to be missed. You just need to stop over-giving to be respected. And once that clicks, you don't chase connection anymore. You attract the kind that actually lasts.